Let's do another practice here. This is a passage we have already skimmed. It's the one about Hurston that we saw earlier. So you don't need to skim it again. Go ahead, give this question a try. Unpause when you think you have the correct answer, and I'll go over it. Okay. In sentence 4, reproduced below, the writer wants to support the main idea about Hurston conveyed in this paragraph. Okay, so sentence 4 is what we're primarily concerned with. However, we also need to know what the main idea of this paragraph is. So this paragraph is here. So we're going to need to reread this whole paragraph and figure out what the main idea of the whole paragraph is. Once we've figured that out, then we can figure out how to support that main idea. So let's give it a read. Hurston ascribed much of her deeply individualistic personality to the experience of growing up in Eatonville, Florida. The town was unique in that it was particularly hot in the summer, but mild at other times of the year. Hurston always said growing up in a community totally separate from the larger white society allowed her a freedom and independence not available to everyone in the South. Okay, so that's kind of the main idea here, right? Is that this town that Hurston grew up in influenced her personality, and it influenced her personality by giving her more freedom and independence because she didn't live around white people, essentially. So let's find out which supports that idea. Sentence 4, the town was unique in that it was particularly hot in the summer but mild at other times of the year. We want to figure out which of these best supports the idea about it shaping her personality. So I think A, as it is now, we can kind of eliminate very quickly, right? This paragraph doesn't talk about the weather in this town. This paragraph is talking about the kind of social situation of the town, the racial makeup of the town, and the way that those factors influenced her, right? It's not saying that she was influenced by growing up here because it was hot in the summer. That's not what the main idea is here. B, the town was unique in that it was a fairly typical Florida small town found in the mid-19th century. I think this is immediately eliminatable, just on the fact that it says the town was unique in that it was fairly typical. That is a contradiction in itself, and then also, right, it obviously has nothing to do with the main idea of the passage, or the paragraph, rather. C, the town was unique in that it was the first all-black town to be incorporated in the country. That could definitely fit, right, because it's talking about how she grew up away from white people, and how that impacted her personality. So I think C could be correct. D, the town was unique in that it was not yet in existence at the start of the Civil War. Well, that doesn't really fit in with the main idea about the kind of social makeup of the town influencing her. So it's not D. And E, the town was unique in that it was racially integrated, even at a time when Jim Crow laws reigned in the South. Okay, so E is another one that could fit with the main idea here. The difference between C and E is that they're kind of operates opposites, right? C says it's an all-black town. E says it's racially integrated. We need to kind of use the hints to figure out which one's true, right? They both support the idea about the racial makeup of the town influencing her. We just need to know, is it an all-black town or is it an integrated town? Well, this last sentence, the sentence that comes after sentence 4, sentence 5, says she grew up in a community that was totally separate from the larger white society. So that tells us that E is going to be the correct answer here. So yeah, that's supporting idea questions. Either they give us the idea, or we have to figure out the idea on our own. I mean, we always have to figure out the idea to some extent. Sometimes we need to do a little bit more work to figure it out, but we always want to pay attention to everything, right? Pay attention to all the details and make sure every detail fits with what we're trying to support. And we want to kind of use the same thought process we use when we write our own evidence, right? It needs to be directly related to what the idea is, not just kind of similar to it. It has to support it, right? It either has to give an example, or it needs to clarify something or amplify something along those lines. Next up, we have adding phrases questions. These questions, we will either add a phrase, or we could also be changing a phrase, but we'll add or change some either word or a group of words to either set up a comparison or to provide an appropriate transition. That's what these questions ask us to do, either set up a comparison or provide an appropriate transition. And they're very similar. Setting up a comparison and providing a transition are very similar in that we need to see either what we're transitioning from and what we're transitioning to, or what things we're comparing, right? And then we need to, based on that, pick the phrase that most effectively does it. These questions require an understanding of transition words and their meanings, which is something we have talked about. We talked about it in lesson 3, I think, where we talked about sophistication, right? That same idea, those same concepts that we focused on are going to come into play for this question type. We can identify these questions because simply they will ask us to either add a phrase or change a phrase. We can also identify them based on the answer choices, though, because the answer choices will consist of transitional words and phrases. Okay. Before we get to the method, I want to actually go through the review first of transitional phrases before we get to the method. We talked about this already. If you need a refresher, go ahead and pause the video and you can look over this list. If you don't need a refresher, you don't need to pause the video. These are not all of the transitional phrases that exist. These are just kind of the most common ones. There are more, but you can kind of apply the same logical thought process to all of them, right? Whatever relationship they convey, that's when you want to use it, right? If you're trying to convey a contrasting relationship, you're going to want to use one from this list. And there are differences between all these, right? They can't all be used interchangeably. Conversely, and however, are slightly different, right? They do both convey contrasts. However is more like... conversely is more like direct, like showing two different situations almost, whereas however is saying, even though this happened, this thing also happened. And that's true for all 4 of these, right? For all 4 of these types, they can't necessarily all be used interchangeably, but identifying the relationship is kind of the most important part. So if we're introducing evidence, right, something from here. If we're showing a cause and effect relationship, something from here. Stuff like that. Okay, so the method for adding phrases questions. We first want to read the sentence before where we add the phrase, and then we want to read the sentence where we'll be adding the phrase. After we've read both of those sentences, we need to identify the relationship between them. Kind of what I just talked about, right? Do they contrast with each other? Is one supporting the other? Is one giving an example of the other? Is it a cause and effect relationship? Is it a kind of step-by-step guide to something? Whatever the relationship is, we need to identify it. Once we've identified it, then we want to choose the transitional word that fits with that relationship. So if it's contrasting, we'll use something like however, or on the other hand, right? If it's an example, we'll use something like for example, or something like that. If it's cause and effect, something like therefore. Stuff like that. If there's no identifiable relationship, or if none of the answer choices seem to fit the relationship, the correct answer may not be a transitional phrase at all, but rather some kind of introductory phrase. If you're reading it and you're like, these are just 2 sentences, you might not need a transitional word necessarily. There might be a sneaky answer choice in there that's actually not conveying a transition. And in that case, that would be the correct answer. Those question types are rare. Most of the time, your answer is going to be a transitional phrase. Therefore, you want to check for the transitional relationships first. you only want to choose a non-transitional answer choice if you've eliminated all the other options and it matches with the content of the sentences. So if you're like none of these transition phrase options work, then you can kind of consider an answer choice that isn't a transitional phrase and see if that one works. So let's do some practice. This is a new passage, I believe, so you can go ahead and skim this one and then take a look at question 33 and see if you can figure out which phrase we should add or change in order to convey the relationship between the sentences. Okay, so we are changing a phrase at the beginning of sentence 5, which means that we need to read sentence 4 and 5. Well, actually, in this case, I don't know if we necessarily do. Hang on, let me see. In this case, the transition is within the same sentence. I think it's within the two clauses in the same sentence. So in this case, we don't need to read two separate sentences because the two things we're transitioning from are in the same sentence, essentially. So it says, something Einstein didn't live to see it. The universe proved the accuracy of his calculations in 1970 when Cygnus X1 was discovered about 7,000 light years from Earth. Okay, so we're transitioning between Einstein didn't live to see it and the universe proved the accuracy of his calculations in 1970. So what kind of relationship do we have here? Well, it doesn't seem like an example, right? It doesn't seem like a cause and effect, right? It's not like the universe proved the accuracy of his calculations because he died. It almost seems like the relationship here is sort of a contrasting in a way. It's saying that, you know, kind of even though he didn't live to see it, the universe proved the accuracy of his calculations in 1970, right? He died, but the universe proved that he was right. So which of our answer choices would convey that? Well, it wouldn't be in fact. That's one we can eliminate right away. And then because is also one we can eliminate right away, right? Because is cause and effect. That's not what we have. In fact is kind of introducing evidence or something like that, which also doesn't fit this relationship. We have although, by contrast, and since. Since is also cause and effect, so I think we can get rid of that one. I think we're down to although or by contrast, which both show some sort of contrasting relationship. Now we need to determine which one fits the context better. So either although Einstein didn't live to see it, the universe proved the accuracy of his calculations in 1970, or by contrast, Einstein didn't live to see it, the universe proved the accuracy of his calculations in 1970. Well, now that we've kind of looked at both of them here, it seems pretty obvious. Although is going to be the correct answer here. By contrast, you know, kind of implies that it's some sort of direct contrast, right? Which is not the case. We're not directly, you know, contrasting two ideas. We're just showing that there's some sort of like disagreement between the two ideas, right? You wouldn't expect them to fit, but they do fit. And that's kind of what although says, right? Even though he didn't live to see it, the universe proved the accuracy of his calculations in 1970. So B is the correct answer for this one. Let's try another one. This is a passage we have already read, so you don't need to skim again. Go ahead, try this question, unpause when you are done. Okay, the writer wants to add a phrase at the beginning of sentence 14. Adjusting the capitalization is needed to set up a comparison, right? I said setting up a comparison is something we can do with the idea discussed in sentence 13. Which of the following choices best accomplishes this goal? Okay, same thought process, right? Even if it asks us, you know, this one asks us to, this one actually didn't even ask about creating a transition. But whether we're creating a transition or a comparison, same process. Because a lot of the times, transitional words are what we're going to use, or transitional phrases are what we're going to use to set up comparisons, right? Essentially, 4 out of 5 of these are transitional phrases. Today is the only one that's not really a transitional phrase. So let's see if we can figure this out. We need to read sentence 13 and sentence 14, right? We need to see what we're comparing. So sentence 13, history has shown that Hurston was right. Okay, that's our first idea. Our second idea, modern critics admire her authentic and skillful representation of the language as well as her realistic, portrayal of daily life in the early 20th century. Okay, so it's not contrasting, right? It's not necessarily giving an example, although it sort of is. It's more so just kind of giving evidence. History has shown that she was right, and then it talks about how modern critics like her work. So it's kind of supporting that idea that she was right. I think we can eliminate however, right? Because there's no contrast here. And I think we can eliminate despite this fact for the same reason as however. Thus, and in addition, are our last two remaining transitional words here, right? Today is not really a transitional word, so we'll kind of save that for the end, just if none of the other ones work. Let's try thus. Thus is kind of cause and effect. Does that fit? Well, history has shown that she was right. Thus, modern critics admire her authentic and skillful representation. No, that doesn't really fit, because that's telling us that the reason why modern critics admire her authentic representation of the language is because history has shown that she was right, which doesn't make sense, right? History has shown that she was right is not a reason anything happens. It's a general claim, and this is supporting that claim. So that's not causing this to happen, so thus does not make sense. In addition means we're providing additional detail or additional information. That could maybe work here. Let's see. History has shown that she was right. In addition, modern critics admire her authentic and skillful representation of the language. It doesn't exactly fit, because in addition kind of means that it's transitioning between like one piece of evidence and another piece of evidence. That's how we would use in addition, right? One reason why something happens and another reason why something happens. In addition kind of means that the purpose of the previous sentence and the purpose of the sentence that we're additioning or adding, I guess would be the word, are kind of the same, right? It's either two pieces of evidence, two examples, two reasons, two steps, to something. And that's not what's happening here. We have a claim and evidence. So in addition doesn't work, because we wouldn't use in addition to set up... There was a mosquito. Now it's dead. We wouldn't use in addition to set up a piece of evidence. So we're left with today, which is, like I said, not a transitional word. Let's see if that one works. So history has shown that she was right. So the previous one's talking about history. And now this one's talking about modern critics. So today, maybe it does work. Today, modern critics admire her authentic and skillful representation of the language, as well as her realistic portrayal of daily life in the early 20th century. Yeah, that does make sense, right? If we're talking about modern critics, but the previous one was talking about history, today is a good way to kind of, I guess it is sort of a transitional phrase, right? It's not a typical one, but it does sort of transition between the idea of talking about history and the idea of talking about modern critics. Even if it wasn't necessarily a transition from this idea, it still does work as an introductory phrase to this sentence, right? Today, modern critics admire her authentic representation. So B is the correct answer for this one. All right, so we have gotten through, I think, 3 question types here. I think we're about halfway through with this. Let's take a look at dividing paragraph questions, our next question type. This question type asks us or requires us to either decide whether or not to divide a paragraph or to decide where to divide a paragraph, or potentially both. Sometimes it'll say, should the author divide or should the author not divide? Other times it'll say, which would be the best place to divide this paragraph? And in both cases, we need to essentially identify whether or not the paragraph is focused on the same topic throughout. That is kind of what makes a paragraph, right? Each paragraph, just like in our own writing, you'll see that a lot of these writing questions follow the same concepts as the free response questions, which is why I wanted to talk about the free response first, right? Because once we master our own writing, changing other people's writing becomes a lot easier. So just like in our own writing, how we talked about how every body paragraph should be its own claim, same thing applies to other people's writing, right? Everything that is in a paragraph should be cohesive. It should be kind of focusing on the same idea. If a body paragraph starts to stray and talk about a different idea, that's when we should divide it. If it asks us where to divide it, well, then we just need to identify where it starts to stray into a different topic. And that's where the division of the paragraph should happen. They're easy to identify. It will explicitly ask you to divide a paragraph. So here's our method. Read the paragraph in question. It'll tell you which paragraph you're talking about, obviously. Go ahead, read that entire paragraph, and pay attention to the main idea of the paragraph at the beginning. Pay attention to what the paragraph is focused on, what the focus of it is. And then as you're reading, ask yourself, does the entire paragraph focus on the same main idea, on the same claim, on the same topic? Is there a point where the author starts talking about something different? And if it does, that's where you should split it, right? As soon as you start talking about a different topic, split it up, 2 paragraphs. If the question asks you where to split the paragraph, you can use the answer choices to help you. Because you have a specific number of options, right? So you can say, okay, line 4. Let me check line 4. Does everything before line 4 talk about one thing, and does everything after line 4 talk about another thing? If it does, yeah, okay, sure, that's correct. If it doesn't, not correct. If it asks you if you should or shouldn't split the paragraph, you can use the reasoning in each answer choice to help you. Sometimes it's not immediately clear if you should or shouldn't divide the paragraph. Sometimes it could go either way, and what's going to make your decision about whether or not to divide it is the reasoning, right? If the reasoning is really good for one of the options that says to split it, and you were kind of on the fence, then maybe you should split it if the reasoning fits. Or if you're on the fence and one of the reasonings is really good for not splitting it, you can go ahead and not split it based on the reasoning. I've found that a lot of times with these questions that just asked you, not the ones that ask you where to split or where to divide it, but the ones that ask you if you should or shouldn't, the closest 2 answer choices is one answer choice that says to divide and one answer choice that says not to. And it's essentially a decision based on the reasoning. That's what I've found a lot of the time. So even if your initial thought is, no, I think it works fine, maybe we can just keep it, if one of the answer choices that says to divide it has really solid reasoning, you can change your mind. And additionally, it's also important to read all of the answer choices for that reason, right? Don't immediately make a decision about whether or not you think it should be divided and only read the answer choices that agree with that decision. The reasoning is a big deal. So read all the answer choices. Here is an example. It's the Hurston passage again. No need to skim. Jump right into this question. Pay attention to the paragraph it's talking about and see if you can figure out what the correct answer is. Unpause when you're done. Okay. The writer has decided to divide the 3rd paragraph into 2 parts. The best place to add the new paragraph break would be at the beginning of sentence what? Okay, so this is one where we can use the answer choices to help us, right? Because it's either 9 or 10, or do not divide it at all. And we also have reasoning here. So we can use the reasoning to kind of guide us as well. But let's first start by reading the 3rd paragraph. It's a very long one. We'll pay attention to what the main idea is. We'll pay attention to if the entire paragraph focuses on that main idea, and we'll specifically pay attention to the areas around sentences 9 and 10 and see if we can identify a shift. It says, Hurston began her undergraduate studies at Howard University, but her obvious intelligence and talent soon earned her a scholarship to Barnard College in New York City. Moving north in the 1920s thrust her into the midst of the Harlem Renaissance, a black cultural movement that spawned exceptional achievements in literature, art, and music. Interacting with the likes of Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Billie Holiday, and Duke Ellington, Hurston developed her skills as a writer and published numerous short stories and poems. Okay, so up until this point, we're talking about how when she was in New York, she became part of the Harlem Renaissance and became a writer. The most influential work that came to define her career grew out of her attempt to capture the Black experience. That novel, called Their Eyes Were Watching God, traced 3 generations of a family living in Eatonville. Her authentic representation of the Southern dialect caused her Harlem Renaissance contemporaries to belittle the work for what they saw as propagation of inaccurate stereotypes. Hurston, however, remained true to her project, convinced that the accuracy of her representation would ultimately prevail over the political pressures her peers sought to inflict upon her. Okay, so if this was a question that asked us if we should or shouldn't split, right, this is where, and I guess it kind of does because is do not divide. This is where the reasoning really helps, right? Because I think it could go either way here. It is all sort of around the same idea about her, being part of the Harlem Renaissance and being a writer. However, there is sort of a shift in this general area where it starts talking, instead of talking about her more generally, it starts talking about her work specifically. So that could be a place where we divide the paragraph. So that's kind of my ideas going into this, right? And I'm going to go ahead and let the answer choices speak for themselves here, because I'm not dead set on anything. I could keep it as one paragraph. I could split it. Let's see what the answer choices say. So A says we should split at the beginning of sentence 9 because it would indicate that Hurston's writing was most strongly influenced by Langston Hughes. So right away, I'm going to go ahead and eliminate A just for the reasoning. It would indicate that Hurston's writing was most strongly influenced by Langston Hughes. That is not true. That is not what the paragraph is really talking about at all. Langston Hughes is just one of many people that it says developed her skills as a writer, and interacting with them developed her skills. So I think A is just bad reasoning, and I can eliminate it right away because of that. B says before sentence 9, or at the beginning of sentence 9, because it would signal the essay's shift in focus to one of Hurston's novels. Okay, this is really good. Signal the essay's shift in focus. Whenever we see that in an answer choice for this question type, we want to pay super close attention to it, because 99.9% of the time, the reason we divide a paragraph is because there's a shift in focus, right? So if that's our reasoning, that's really solid. And it makes sense, right? I already kind of mentioned that from my initial read through. That's something that I picked up on. I talked about how in this area, it starts talking less about her specific, or her generally, and more about her work specifically. And it does that at sentence 9. So B seems like it's a really strong answer choice. B seems like it could be correct here. But let's check all of our options. C, it should be split at the beginning of sentence 10 because all the remaining sentences in the paragraph provide a detailed summary of the plot of Hurston's novel. Well, let's see. That novel called Their Eyes Were Watching God traced 3 generations of a family living in Eatonville. That, I guess, gives a summary. Her authentic representation of the Southern dialect caused her Harlem Renaissance contemporaries to belittle the work for what they saw as its propagation of inaccurate stereotypes. No. So, yeah, that's not giving a summary of the novel. C is not correct. And then D, it should be before sentence 10 because it would indicate that the essay is now going to focus on the social conditions in Eatonville. Well, we know that's not true, right? So C and D, the reasonings don't match. So even if we did say, okay, maybe 10's a possible place to split it, because the reasonings are bad, we're not going to choose them. Even if we did like splitting it before 10, neither of the answer choices are correct, right? Neither of them work. And then E says, do not divide the paragraph into 2 parts. I could be convinced to go with E if none of the other answer choices fit, but I think B is way stronger, right? There is definitely a shift in focus here. The only reason I would go with E on a question like this is if none of the other answer choices fit. B 100% fits. And it is the correct answer here. Let's try another. Is this a passage? Yes, it's the cat passage that we've seen before. Go ahead, give this question a shot, and we'll talk about it after. Okay. The writer is considering the possibility of dividing up the second paragraph into 2 parts, and possibly adding or deleting words in order to aid the overall flow of the text, adjusting capitalization as necessary. Should the writer make this change, and what alterations might be necessary? So this is a little bit different. It's asking us to make alterations as well. Those alterations are not necessarily as important as the decision about dividing the paragraph. They are all kind of similar, and we can use our transition word skills to figure that out. Let's focus first on whether we want to divide this paragraph. So we're talking about the second paragraph. Whoops. The second paragraph. And if we look at our answer choices, the places are kind of sentence after sentence 6, after sentence 6, or after sentence 7. Those are kind of our two options. Let's read. Let's see if we can figure this out. When communicating with each other, cats' talk is a complex system of nonverbal signals. In particular, their tails, rather than any kind of speech, provide cats' chief means of expression. They also use physical contact to express their feelings. With other cats, cats will use their voices only to express pain. Next, incredibly, all of that changes when a human walks into the room. Cats use a wide range of vocal expressions when they communicate with a person, from affectionate meows to menacing hisses. Since cats' verbal expressions are not used to communicate with other cats, it is logical to conclude that cats developed this language expressly to communicate with their human owners. Okay, so I did notice a shift here. Our main idea up until this point was that cats only use nonverbal signals to talk to other cats. Then at this point, we start talking about humans, right? It goes from how cats talk to other cats to how cats talk to humans. So I could definitely support dividing the paragraph here. Again, right, it has to match with our reasoning in one of our answer choices, but that's kind of what I'm leaning towards right now. So A says, do not divide up the paragraph or make any changes to the wording. I'm definitely leaning against that. I don't want to eliminate it yet. However, not only do I think it should be divided, I also don't think that this next makes sense, using my knowledge of transitional phrases. So I am highly, highly against A. I would only pick A if I know for certain that all the other ones are not correct. B, begin a new paragraph after sentence 6. Okay, I like that part. And eliminate the word next in sentence 7. I like that part as well. So I am definitely leaning towards B now. I identified that area would make sense to split it, and I also identified that the next doesn't make sense. This just says eliminate it instead of changing it to something. And yeah, that's better. So definitely think B is probably the correct answer. Let me check my other options though. C says, do not begin a new paragraph, but eliminate the word next in sentence 7. Well, I think that's better than A. However, I do think making a new paragraph here is better than not splitting it. Because I already identified, right, that at this point, there's a shift in focus. The first part is all about how cats talk to each other. The second part is all about how cats talk to humans. So it does make sense to divide the paragraphs there. So I think B is still better than C for that reason. D, begin a new paragraph after sentence 6 and replace the word next with at this time. All right, so that would say at this time, incredibly, all of that changes when a human walks into the room. That would kind of convey that, well, it only happens now, which doesn't make sense, right? I like B better of just getting rid of next. I think at this time might even be worse than next there. So I don't think it's D. And then D says begin a new paragraph after sentence 7 and add the word nevertheless to the beginning of sentence 8. So right away I am kind of not liking E because I don't like where it splits it. That would split it after it says, incredibly, all of that changes when a human walks into the room. I think that should be part of the second paragraph, not the first paragraph, right? Because if the second paragraph's talking about how they talk to humans, I think introducing the idea of a human walking into the room should be part of that second paragraph, not the first one. And I think nevertheless at the beginning of sentence 8 doesn't make sense, because nevertheless kind of shows a contrast, right? But that's not what's going on here. It says that it changes when a human walks into the room and that they use a wide range of vocal expressions to talk to humans. Those are kind of along the same lines, right? They support each other. They don't contrast each other at all. So B is what I'm going with, and it is the correct answer here. So hopefully this question type makes sense. Two things we mainly look at, right? Why to split, where to split.